Greenhouse gases, in other words, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, and your boyfriend's morning breath, are responsible for climate change. That is not my opinion, that is a fact. In 2018, the world's greenhouse gas emissions accumulated to approximately 53.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That is equivalent to 5.3 million Eiffel Towers hovering above us in the sky. But saying that everybody contributed equally to those emissions is like saying every character in Harry Potter is equally important. Hedwig, never cared about you, Fred. Oh no, Snape, what a tragedy. We know this movie is secretly about you, Argus. You and I, we know it.
Welcome to the first and only CO2 Cup here on planet Earth. It's a carbon dioxide race starting in the 18th century, and we're off. From the get-go, the colonies of Britain in pink. Hey Canada, here comes Prussia in 1791, and the rest of Europe starts following suit. Vive la Revolution, Napoleon amps it up. The Brits hotbox the entirety of London. The Civil War makes America blush. Germany unifies. India off the mat completely. Australia, look at that. USA now cherry-flavored and leading the pack. Holds through World War I. Central and West Africa get in there. Rumbles in the East as China starts coughing up, and the USSR gives us some data, then collapses. It looks like the US will coast to a win, but it is neck and neck as we round the 20th century, and China takes the lead. In 2006, the US just can't catch up. What a finish, China, the Peking of the hill. Wow, what a competition. And we're not even done yet. Back to you, Lucas.
So as you can see, the red countries on this map are responsible for most of the world's greenhouse gases. But what are the areas most affected by climate change?
North Africa and the Middle East with a jump start, while Greenland is watching. Oh, Brazil looks devastated, but the US and Southeast Asia also seem in trouble. Canada and Russia starting to enjoy the heat, and everybody dies.
So, as you can clearly see, the countries causing the most greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change are not the countries being affected as much from it, at least when it comes to temperature. And where I'm from, we call that
climate inequality.
Welcome everybody to the Earth Show. I'm your host Lucas, and today we will discuss what climate change means in regards to inequality, how the climate crisis further increases worldwide inequality, and how we might be able to solve this problem on a global and local level. Since the 80s, we all should know the effects that climate change will have on nature. Just like when Argus Filch enters the room, we will see rising temperatures and levels of wetness. Rising sea levels. Other symptoms will be the dangerous salinization of groundwater, droughts, and very frequent, unpredictable extreme weather events, which will lead to the extinction of hundreds of thousands of animals and plants. Those are the direct effects on nature. But what about the effects on the upright shaped chimpanzees we call people? Yeah, what about the effects on mankind? Since the early 2000s, the impact of climate change on poverty and livelihood has also been analyzed. In 2002, a World Bank report about poverty and climate change highlighted that due to the economic influence of climate-sensitive sectors, mostly agriculture, poor countries are more vulnerable to a changing climate. On top of that, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, climate change will reduce access to drinking water, food security, negatively affect the health of poor people, and is viewed as the world's biggest challenge in meeting the Millennium Development Goals for poverty eradication and sustainable development. In 2007, the Stern Review, led by the former World Bank chief economist Nicholas Stern, also concluded that developing countries were especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in an already vulnerable environment and with climate-sensitive economies. In addition, those same countries have low incomes that make it even harder for them to adapt, noting that in the next decades, the world's population will grow by around 2 to 3 billion people, all of them in developing countries and regions affected by climate change. In 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change even reached the conclusion that climate change will create new poverty pockets in countries with increasing inequality. That's both developing and developed countries. And finally, we'll go a little bit back in time. In 2007 precisely, the Human Development Report by the United Nations Development Programme discussed the effects of climate change on the developing country's economy and said that short-term effects might not be large to world GDP, but the consequences for the world's poorest people might be outright, quote, apocalyptic. And I think the only time that apocalyptic should not sound alarming is when Roland Emmerich is talking about his latest fucking movie production. But all the more alarming when we talk about worldwide inequality. Now, in order to better understand what inequality in regards to climate change can mean, we will compare two countries with roughly the same population size, but very different locations, economic powers, and influences on and consequences from climate change. Let's look at two countries with the letter B. Brazil and Belarus. That would be a big exhibition of balls. I'm talking football and Lukashenko's massive balls, of course. No. Bangladesh and Bulgaria? That is like this guy from a Bulgarian talent show pulling a car with his penis, but the penis is me attached to your head, and the car is a stereotype that Bangladesh is part of India being pulled out of your brain. No. We are comparing Belgium and Bolivia. Both countries have around 11.5 million inhabitants. However, Bolivia emits 22.26 million tons of CO2 per year, and Belgium emits 4 times that number with nearly 100 million tons of CO2 per year. That's like sharing a household with Shaquille O'Neal.
I mean, we split our grocery costs, but he ate a week's supply of cereals in one episode of the Queen's Gambit check.
So in order to figure out each country's exposure and coping mechanisms in regards to climate change, let's take a look at the country's geographical locations and their economies. Bolivia is a landlocked country in the center of South America, whereas Belgium is in the middle of Europe. The country that gave us waffles, the JPEG format and the body mass index enjoys a maritime climate with cool summers and mild winters. Rainfall amounted to around 800 to 900 millimeters in the last few years. In the last decade, the country's average temperature was around 17 degrees Celsius, but with climate change it might rise up to 21 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Being 36 times larger than Belgium, Bolivia is covered by the Amazon forest in the east and the Andes in the west, giving it a mix of tropical and desert polar climate with over 1,000 millimeters of mean annual precipitation. The country's average temperature is predicted to increase from 15 to 19 degrees Celsius in the next century. Economically speaking, both countries are as different as day and night. Belgium ranks 18th worldwide when it comes to GDP per capita with $47,518. Bolivia, on the other hand, is on spot 117 with $3,548 per capita, and therefore is the second poorest country in South America. To make this even more clear, the World Bank estimates that 10.5% of Bolivia's population live below the poverty line with less than $3.20 per day at their disposal. You know how many live below that poverty line in Belgium? 0%. When it comes to exposure to natural disasters, Belgium is as boring as your colleague Janine talking about her cats Pinky and Sprinky. Except for a cyclone in 2013 and floods in 2016, Belgium is pretty much free from natural disasters. Bolivia, on the other hand, has to deal with them almost every season of the year now. A big one being El Niño that leads to floods and mudslides every yearly rain season. On top of that, outside the rain season, Bolivians experience droughts that lead to forest fires like in the Amazon in the beginning of 2020 and glacier melting in the western mountainous region of the country. With 30% of Bolivia's working population working in agriculture, these climate hazards have a much larger impact on the country's economy and the poorest parts of the population than in Belgium, where only 0.7% of its GDP stems from agriculture. The United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean predict Bolivia's agricultural sector to be affected with up to 70% in losses through climate change. Floods, changing temperatures, and changing seasons, an erosion of nearly 60% of Bolivia's fertile ground, desalinization of the soil, and increasing number of plagues affect crop yields. A big flood in 2014 alone is said to have killed 14% of Beni's cattle, a province that is highly reliant on livestock. But let's not just look at the effect that the changing weather has on agriculture. According to Bolivia's Ministry of Development, 43% of the country's population lived in areas exposed to floods in 2012. That is nearly half of the country. Many of these people only can afford the most basic housing, which is not resilient enough to withstand regular floods. This combined with low sanitation creates disastrous outcomes for the families affected. Just in 2015, Bolivia's government estimated the costs of floods to be around $450 million, at least 1% of its GDP, and saw 300,000 people affected. But what is even worse is that it is predicting the costs from floods and strong rainfalls to reach $3 billion every year. Imagine 7.5% of all the money that your country generates just literally being washed away.
And here's the money.
Thanks, boss, for the salary. Let me just flush it down the toilet. And if you think, well, at least most of the floods will just happen in the eastern part of the country, you're right. But I have a little surprise for you, because Bolivia is being fucked on both sides by climate change, like a geographical double penetration sandwich. In the west, the country accounts for 20% of the world's tropical glaciers, which are melting at an alarming rate and have already lost 43% of its surface area thanks to rising temperatures. Especially in the highlands of Bolivia, these glaciers provide a large part of the drinking water, which now is in danger. Just listen to these Bolivians living in El Alto, a city highly reliant on the glacier water.
For this neighborhood, it's become a crisis situation. Residents have to trudge daily to draw water from a single tap they must all share. 400 families live on this side and there are 600 families on the lower side, and these 1,000 families use this one faucet, which is insufficient. An elderly neighbor is equally distressed. We need water in our homes. Besides, I have eye troubles, I can't see well, I'm not well. We need water, I need water urgently.
And you thought being at the fire festival was bad. Try doing that for decades, but without the public interest because rich kids didn't get to see Blink 182. And as if floods and water scarcity weren't enough, I'm still not talking about the threat of mudslides, droughts and forest fires that all have badly affected Bolivia as well. But you have to admit that if there are floods in the eastern part of the country and you don't have any drinking water in the west, and both of those problems meet in the middle, where do you even go? Of course, Bolivia has not been waiting for the world to just become a better place because A, that never happens, and B, it literally has people dying from the consequences if the government doesn't act. A concept that some people might not be familiar with, but yes, Donald, inaction also has consequences. One of the most notorious adaptations being the implementation of the law of Mother Earth in 2012. In indigenous beliefs, Mother Earth is viewed as a sacred home, and this law gives it legal rights to life and regeneration just like with human beings, paving a way to renewable energy and more eco-friendly production. Obviously, the law has been heavily opposed by agricultural producers and the mining industry and doesn't magically solve Bolivia's problems. Problems they're not just able to fix themselves, as the former president Evo Morales pointed out at the United Nations.
Los países desarrollados, por su responsabilidad histórica, deben tomar la iniciativa para hacer frente a este desafío. El enfoque no debe limitarse a la mitigación solamente, sino también adoptar las deficiencias relativas a la financiación, la tecnología y el apoyo a la creación de capacidades.
But let's come back to Belgium for a second. Will climate change affect the inventors of inline skates and the saxophone? Let me ask you this question. Is Belgium even on Earth? Or is it an optical illusion created by speeding cars on the German Autobahn and tourists smoking weed in Amsterdam? If Belgium is on Earth, then of course it will be affected by climate change. Mainly because it is so close to the sea level that rising sea levels could literally drown parts of the country. Or as a report commissioned by Greenpeace put it, adapting to a rise in sea level of 50 centimeters or 1 meter is without a doubt not too difficult in a rich country. But when it is known that uninterrupted global warming would very likely lead to a rise of 8 meters within 1,000 years, we should ask ourselves which towns and villages will be celebrating their 1,500th or 2,000th anniversary with their feet on the water. So even though both countries will be affected by climate change to some extent, Belgium is far more economically prepared to adapt to those changes. The example of Bolivia and Belgium are just one of many where countries contribute to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere in vastly different levels, but suffer from it very distinctively. And Bolivia isn't even the country hit hardest from climate change. Heck, it is not even in the top 10. It could be much worse than just floods and droughts or glacier melting as in Bolivia. For example, your country could just be wiped out from the map in the next decades. The small island nation Kiribati is said to be uninhabitable within the next 50 years. A prediction that even the government there is coming to peace with by purchasing 5,000 acres of land in Fiji, and not for a Pacific holiday resort, but just to fucking survive as a country. On top of that, it has implemented its Migration with Dignity program for a planned abandonment of the island by its citizens, which is just heartbreaking.
I don't want to live here because I was born here and my sisters live here as well. But if the effects But if that fact affects me, then I will have you to leave here. I feel very sad and it hurts to leave where you come from.
Yeah, that is legitimately sad. Just think about fleeing the place where you grew up forever because it's being swallowed by the ocean. There's nothing you can do about it, but you know that someone else could have totally done something about it. And by someone else, I mean us here, in developed countries, with the most greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, even you, Jenny, who orders her latte with oat milk, even you can still do more about it. Without a doubt, climate change will increase inequality, putting minorities and especially women in disadvantage, because in poor populations, girls will be taken out of school in increasingly dire economic situations. This climate crisis will make poorer countries poorer and might even make richer countries richer. A study from Stanford University concluded that Sweden's, Canada's and Norway's economies increased 25 to 34% between 1961 and 2010 thanks to global warming. And this is a vicious cycle too. Of course, just being bad wasn't enough for climate change. Climate hazards will cause a disproportionate loss of income and assets for the disadvantaged poor. This creates inequality and an even greater exposure and vulnerability to climate hazards. But finally, what solutions are there to make this go away? I'm sorry, but I have to tell you that we will not be able to make this go away. Yeah, we won't. But it still makes so much sense to adapt if we don't want things to get worse. Countries affected by climate change are implementing individual solutions like, for example, Bolivia with its Law for Mother Earth, or the Great Green Wall initiative by the African Union to build an 8,000-kilometer strip of sustainable land over the African continent. But there also have to be global solutions because climate change cannot be diminished only within one country. It needs the whole world, especially the countries contributing the most CO2 emissions. And don't get me wrong, there are several global agreements on this topic already. In 1992, the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities that for the first time acknowledged different capabilities and responsibilities to combat climate change. Then, in 1997, the world came together for the Kyoto Protocol, in which 37 developed countries committed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by an average 5% compared to 1990 levels over the period of 2008 to 2012. On October 28th of this godforsaken year 2020, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol finally was accepted by 145 of its 192 parties and legally binded members to reduce their carbon emissions in the period of 2013 to 2020 by 18% compared to 1990 levels. And that is something really, really good. Honestly, this is really good news in 2020. But, I like big buts and I cannot lie, there's just one small, tiny, minor issue to it. And I'm really sorry to darken the mood, but you know which one is the only country that has signed the Kyoto Protocol but not ratified it? The United States of fuck me America. Oh, and call me snitch, but the only country that completely withdrew from the protocol in 2012 is the US's little sister that always plays a good one, Canada. And this brings us to the Paris Agreement. Only the second time Donald Trump doesn't regret pulling out. On December 12, 2015, nearly all 197 members of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change signed the Paris Agreement and thereby committed to maintain a rise in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius until the end of the century. Bravo, not bad. That's like all of us living together in a house and someone says, I can smell something burning. You're right, I can smell something burning too. I can smell it burning too. Should we put out that fire soon? But how much has really been done since then? While a lot of good things have happened, like the European Union assigning 30% of its multi-annual budget and post-COVID recovery fund to climate mitigation, or Morocco being one of the only countries in the world to meet 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold of the Paris Agreement, a 2019 report from the Universal Ecological Fund concluded that of the 184 climate pledges, only 20% were deemed sufficient and almost 75% were deemed partially or completely insufficient, including 4 of the top 5 global greenhouse gas emitters. The largest emitter, China's carbon emissions, even increased by 80% between 2005 and 2018. India's emissions also grew 76% from 2005 to 2017. The United States withdrew from the agreement And Russia, the 5th largest emitter, hasn't even submitted a fucking plan to reduce carbon emissions yet. On top of that, 126 of the 184 climate pledges depend largely on international funding and technology that developed countries are responsible for. So yeah, everybody can smell the fire in the house, but only a few people are sprinkling some water drops on it, while others hold a fire extinguisher and don't use it. Now, I know that all of this might sound very depressing, and you're right, it is very depressing. But as I said, I like big butts and I cannot lie, and you other brothers can't deny. But there's hope. In an interview with National Geographic, the renowned climate scientist Sir Robert Watson said, "We have the technology and knowledge to make those emission cuts, but what's missing are strong enough policies and regulations to make it happen." So in that sense, it really needs just us. You, me, your girlfriend, your father's boyfriend, your dog, my hamster, Vladimir Putin's nephew, Will Smith, Justin Bieber, Lionel Messi, the guy from that one meme we all liked, Rammstein. We need everybody to tell our politicians that we are not doing enough, and if we don't want us or our children to live in a world where developing countries face an apocalyptic existence, we have to act now and follow the promises that we made. At the end of the day, we can put the blame on Trump, China, or Thomas because he loves the beef, but it really is in our own hands.